Where does it come from? It's always been there. The fire that burns inside each of us. The need to know more, to push the limits of our understanding further than we ever thought possible. The courage to face our world's most complex challenges. The belief that success comes from commitment, imagination, and expertise. And it requires the background and perspective of scientists and researchers from every corner of the globe. Our world is always changing, and our mission is never complete. To some, this may seem daunting. To us, it's inspiring. Because today, our passion is stronger than ever. When we work together, when we stand for the awesome impact of Earth and space science, we can do more than protect our planet. We can ensure a sustainable future for all humanity. What will you discover?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Eric Davidson, President of the American Geophysical Union.
Good afternoon. So how do you like New Orleans? How do you like New Orleans? All right. So I've heard of about 20,000, 25,000 Fitbit steps per day. Can anyone top that? I'm pleased to be able to introduce you to this year's Union Agency lecture entitled, How Can a Geoscientist Change the World? I'm also pleased to be able to welcome our Union Agency lecturer, Dr. Vaughan Turekian, who has built a successful career at the intersection of science and policy, advising government leaders on issues related to climate change, energy, sustainable development, and so much more. Dr. Turekian is the Senior Board Director for Sustainability Programs at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, a role he assumed after serving as the 5th Science and Technology Advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State. Prior to that, Dr. Turekian was Chief International Officer at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, also launching the Center for Science Diplomacy during his time there. In today's interconnected world, science is a global enterprise, and Earth and space science-related challenges can have implications for health, the environment, national security, and the global economy. Through his work, Dr. Turekian has been dedicated to advancing science and the importance of evidence-based policymaking and science diplomacy. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce him today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Turekian as our Union Agency lecturer.
Thank you, Eric, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the union leadership. I really am deeply grateful for the opportunity to be here today and the opportunity to speak to AGU and its membership, really for providing me this opportunity. The organization's commitment to, over nearly a century, to advance geosciences and impact society is well known. We saw actually some of it in that slide. The AGU has been a central part of my life. In fact, it plays a critical role in the origin story and lore of my family. In his autobiography of his career, my father, a dedicated geochemist and a many decade AGU member, wrote of his wedding details. The Easter wedding date was set by 3 circumstances. The meeting of the American Geophysical Union was held in Washington that week, following Easter. I had sent in abstracts for my talks long before I had met Roxy, my mother. No doubt the romantic airs of the AGU provided for a wonderful honeymoon. I suppose this was a fitting conclusion to a courtship that started with him foregoing his ritualistic New Year's Eve reading of Sverdrup's the oceans, for a first date with his soon-to-be bride. But beyond matrimonial influence, this organization represents and services a dedicated and diverse group of geoscientists who have had profound impacts on some of the major issues at the forefront of international action and diplomacy. I look forward to the opportunity to discuss with you this afternoon some of the perspectives that I have about the ability of geoscience and geoscientists to change the world. I will admit that while I have great passion for the geosciences from a very young age, my true passion and calling was to become the starting shortstop for the New York Yankees. These two passions fleetingly merged during my time on the combined geology and Latin Greek department intramural softball team in college. Classic rock, as we were known, seemed to pave the way for my future in pinstripes. Unfortunately, this guy, Derek Jeter, came along and took what was rightfully mine. So as a plan B, I completed a PhD focused on stable isotope geochemistry. During my time in grad school, two events stand out that initiated the broader role of geoscientists as global change agents. First was when I had the opportunity to interview Dave Keeling as part of an assignment in a dynamic climatology class. I learned about his motivations to take a background in chemistry to understand global processes rather than focus on industrial chemistry. But he also described how the idea of creating a continuous record over decades did have some doubters, questioning whether this was truly research. But the result, the Keeling curve, has provided scientists and policymakers around the world a numerical and visual record of a breathing Earth with increasing atmospheric CO2 concentrations. The second memorable event when I was in graduate school was when Sherry Rowland, Mario Molina, and Paul Crutzen were announced as the 1995 recipients of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their work on ozone depletion mechanisms. The awarding of this prize to environmental chemists, a first, demonstrated the growing, critical link between forefront environmental science and global policy, and the need for the basic research for understanding critical Earth processes. The basic mechanisms that this trio discovered was central to the development of one of the greatest diplomatic breakthroughs, the Montreal Protocol for ozone-depleting substances. This accomplishment was made all the more remarkable, given it occurred during the height of the Cold War, when such long-term cooperation was limited by high-stakes rivalries. Recently, I had the opportunity to talk to John Negroponte, a multi-time U.S. ambassador who as a diplomat was involved in the Montreal Protocol negotiations. In describing the interplay of science and diplomacy, he states, scientists from NOAA and NASA, who together with a small diplomatic team from the State Department went around to countries like Russia, Japan, and Western Europe to explain the science as we understood it. This common scientific understanding was what ultimately made it possible to negotiate the Montreal Protocol. This accomplishment of diplomacy has shown results. Impressively, the protocol has also shown the potential to limit the emissions of a critical class of greenhouse gases. In 2016, the United States and other signatories to the Montreal Protocol went further in negotiating the Kigali Agreement, a glide path for the elimination of a class of chlorofluorocarbon substitutes, HFCs. Last month, following closely on its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the Trump administration indicated that it was planning on keeping its commitment under the Kigali Agreement on HFCs, an important development for efforts to address greenhouse gases. Unlike any other issue, climate change, characterizing it, understanding its causes and impacts, and identifying ways to address it, has proved critical, and the critical link between geoscientists and global policy. I mentioned earlier the iconic Keeling curve and its impact on understanding of atmospheric CO2 increases. The June 24, 1988 New York Times headline reporting on congressional testimony of Dr. James Hansen announced that, quote, global warming has begun, unquote. With these four words, the issue of climate change resonated from the halls of Congress to the homes of people in the US and abroad. It would be part of the arc of a decades-long discussion around the implications of these observed increases in a suite of greenhouse gases. That same year, 1988, the global policy community created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, designed to bring together the top climate scientists around the world to assess the knowns and unknowns and to help provide sound bases for any action. Its impact not only on science but diplomacy resulted in the awarding of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. My own interactions with the IPCC came in two ways. First was as a young staff officer at the National Academies of Sciences in 2001. The nascent Bush administration had just received IPCC's third assessment report, just weeks after announcing they were pulling out of the Kyoto Protocol. Recognizing that they needed to have some position on climate science, they turned to the academies with two requests: tell them about the science of climate change and evaluate the IPCC process, and do it quickly. The Academy took the challenge and appointed Ralph Cicerone as the chair of a blue ribbon committee that included such people as Sherry Rowland and Jim Hansen. I had the pleasure to serve as the study director and watched as the group, under Ralph's leadership, produced a report in record time for the Academy, delivering it to the White House 5 weeks after it was requested. I saw immediately the impact of such input into policy, when during a speech in the Rose Garden, the president, flanked by his cabinet, responded to the Academy stating that, quote, "The working group asked the highly respected National Academy of Sciences to provide us with the most up-to-date information about what is known, about what is not known on the science of climate change." Throughout this process, it was interesting to see how science was incorporated into policy deliberations. In briefing Congress on the single 30-page report, it was almost as if there were two reports. One group had pulled out every part of the report that articulated the great threats associated with climate change, and the other group had pulled out each phrase that highlighted the unknowns associated and uncertainties. It was interesting to see the deconstruction of a carefully prepared document into its component pieces, which really does speak to the challenges that scientists have in communicating complex issues within political environments. In fact, over lunch, we had a conversation about this very thing, and I am sure that many of you in this room have to think about what it means to communicate very complicated scientific uncertainties to communities that oftentimes are looking for digital answers. One of the people on the stage with the president was then Secretary of State Colin Powell. Months after watching the speech, I moved over to the Department of State as a AAAS fellow, working on climate issues, including the IPCC. I was, in fact, one of a growing number of scientists within the Department of State. The growing technical capacity of the State Department was being built because of another Academy report, this one, which among other things created the position of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, or STAS as we are called. It was the first STAS, Norman Newreiter, who worked tirelessly to bring more science fellows into the department. 13 years later, in 2015, I would have the great honor serving as the 5th Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. But before that, as a fellow, I had a chance to meet perhaps the most famous geoscientist diplomat, Secretary of State Powell. During that first meeting, he proudly shared that he too was trained as a geoscientist, and then repeating a line that he had delivered to the National Academy of Sciences annual meeting a year earlier, further explained that his greatest contribution to the field of geology was leaving it and becoming a military officer instead. During that first foray at the State Department, I witnessed firsthand that the critical connection between scientists and global policy, not only climate change, but also related to oceans, fisheries, Arctic science, and space cooperation. Science was an ever-growing part of the nation's diplomatic toolkit. And the link between science and diplomacy is not just the domain of foreign ministries. One of the unique places for scientists to engage internationally is in places where the official political relationships are strained or limited. The history of this is well established. During the Cold War, exchanges between Soviet and American scientists often kept the lanes of communications open. Geoscientists were often central to these efforts, including such events as this 1966 visit by a group of distinguished American scientists to Moscow for the International Oceanography Congress. I heard about many of these interplays and interchanges with the Soviet Union from my own father, who took part in some of these with such colleagues as Wally Broecker and George Veronis. These types of interactions were among a variety of activities during the Cold War to leverage science as a way to build bridges between East and West. 1 year after that IOC meeting, in 1967, President Johnson and Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin launched an initiative that resulted in the creation of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. In fact, researchers from this institute have held important roles in developing some of the scenarios that underpin the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The post-Cold War era has seen an increase in additional science diplomacy activities. And again, geoscientists are important protagonists in such efforts. While at AAAS, I had the opportunity to see the value of earth and environmental scientists working with counterparts no matter what the politics. Even in a place as volatile as North Korea, where British, North Korean, and American geologists and volcanologists have been working together to characterize the structure and dynamics of Mount Pektu on the DPRK-China border. The resulting publication in Science Advances is perhaps the first peer-reviewed major publication involving Western and DPRK North Korean scientists. And despite political challenges, this cooperation continues. Closer to this region in Cuba, scientists such as atmospheric scientist and AGU member Alan Roebuck have worked to keep links between the two countries over the course of nearly a 60-year freeze. Building on his own connections, Alan joined a group of scientists on a visit to Cuba to identify ways to increase science cooperation with special focus on issues of atmospheric monitoring. In fact, I just saw Alan earlier today yesterday during the meeting, and he enthusiastically told me that he was going forward with the next level of his deployment of some equipment into Cuba. Earth sciences offer an obvious opening to Cuba, given shared air and shared seas. I remember well my first visit to Cuba in 2009. While staying at the iconic Hotel Nacional, we came across some employees from the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. Given that not a lot of US government representatives visited Cuba at that time, we asked what they were doing. They replied that they were the, quote, techie folks, sharing with their counterparts best approaches for sharing meteorological and aircraft flight data. Days later, as our charter flight was leaving Cuban airspace for the short flight to Miami, this really isn't the flight, it's taken from Google. But it looked just like that, actually. For the short flight to Miami, the pilot got on the radio and said, quote, "To the American air traffic controllers, Havana Air Control asked me to relay to you how much they enjoyed your visit and that they look forward to the next meeting in Miami where they will teach you how to really do the salsa." Years later, I was sitting in the conference room of the State Department's Office of Cuban Affairs. We were gathered to watch as President Obama's historic arrival in Cuba. As I watched Air Force One landing in Havana, I could only think that perhaps the air traffic controllers guiding the plane into history were the very same ones who just years earlier were having techie conversations with their American counterparts. The president's visit culminated in an intense diplomatic initiative to change the trajectory of history. And as the official relationship changed, substance was needed. So early in the rapprochement were a series of joint agreements. Building on years of work undertaken outside of government by earth and environmental scientists, the US and Cuba established a robust official cooperation on coastal and ocean research and climate change, which continues actually to this day. Famously, another diplomatic initiative that the Obama administration undertook was restarting direct mail service between the US and Cuba. It was widely reported that the first mail delivery carried a letter from President Obama to a Cuban abuela who had become his pen pal. What is less well known is that my office at the State Department, led by my deputy, who up to that point was actually the highest ranking US State Department official to meet with Cuban technical ministry representatives, worked with the US Postal Service and AAAS to have the journal Science delivered in that first shipment. That was a highlight of my tenure as the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary, but it was also a time when the geosciences played a critical role in our US foreign policy. Early in my term, I had the opportunity to serve as the US representative to the innovative US-China Climate Leaders Summit hosted by LA Mayor Garcetti. This event highlighted that we are seeing more and more of commitments by local and municipal governments to real action on climate change and greenhouse gas reduction. Such joint commitment by the US and China to action laid the critical groundwork for what months later would become the 2015 Paris Agreement, a landmark agreement that celebrated its 2-year anniversary yesterday that broke the decades-old logjam on climate change. And while the current US administration has pulled out of the agreement, it is clear, even as you saw earlier this week, that the action is taking place at the local scale, with cities often leading the way. 2015 also witnessed another revolutionary global agreement, the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. 193 heads of state, presidents and prime ministers committed to working towards these 17 universal goals that cover economic, social, and environmental issues to be addressed by 2030. And while these are political commitments, they draw on the many years of sustainability science research, much of which has been developed by people in this room and at this meeting. The Sustainable Development Goals offer a great and valuable opportunity for this community to become engaged in something that is both global in scale and local in action. Science and scientists will need to be involved to make progress towards goals related to such issues as protecting the ocean, increasing access to clean water, and climate change. In my current position at the National Academies, I am leading our efforts in sustainability, and we are working to harness the science, engineering, and medical communities to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. One thing that we have done is to take the catalog of the different studies and meetings undertaken throughout the academies to address the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's remarkable. Almost every unit within the academies does something that contributes to our understanding and action on the SDGs. During my time at the State Department, I had the pleasure to co-chair with the Kenyan UN ambassador the high-level UN dialogue event dedicated to science and technologies for the Sustainable Development Goals. Quite literally, science, including geoscience that underpin numerous SDGs, have become core to diplomacy. I think this is articulated by the fact that then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon showed up and stayed for most of the morning to actually articulate that diplomacy without science was simply talk. Engaging with and connecting to these goals provides one of the ways for people in this room to help the world. Earlier this month, the Inter-Academy Panel for Research published a report recommending ways for scientists, and especially science organizations, to engage with these global goals. One of the focuses of the goals is on the ocean, and the health and sustainability of the ocean was clearly one of the highest priorities for my then boss, Secretary Kerry. And that's Leonardo DiCaprio next to him, actually, it wasn't me. In advance of hosting the Global Summit on Ocean, the Secretary decided that he would like nothing more than to teach a class on the ocean at one of the local high schools. He thought it was such a great idea that he also called up a bunch of foreign ministers from Europe, Africa, and South America and convinced them to do the same thing. So my colleagues and I were charged with preparing material for the Secretary to use and to prepare him for student questions. He chose the Montgomery Blair School in Maryland and the students that had just won the National Science Bowl. So they were bound to actually ask pretty tough questions. The event was scheduled for the Wednesday after Memorial Day. The Friday before class, I got a call. Quote, "The Secretary wants the latest science related to ocean-climate interactions, marine protected areas, nutrient pollution, and ocean acidification. And he wants real science, not a bunch of fact sheets, and the entire papers, not just the summaries." I did say, "You mean the abstracts?" And they said, "The summaries." Anyway. Like a student pulling an all-nighter, my team starts scrubbing for the seminal papers and latest research across those topics. Late that night, we deliver 2 big binders full of papers from Science, JGR, and GRL. Tuesday morning during the senior staff meeting, the Secretary bounds into the room with 2 binders in his hands, just walking in like this, looks up at the senior group of diplomats and states unequivocally, quote, "I spent the weekend," and remember it was a long weekend, "reading all these papers in this binder on the ocean. Folks, this is important stuff. I recommend that you all get copies and read it yourselves." For sure, I think that most of the people around the table started looking at their shoes when he said this. And the conversation quickly turned back to the comfort zone of some crisis in some part of the world. But the very next day, sure enough, the secretary, joined by National Academy of Sciences President Marcia McNutt, taught the kids about the ocean. And in fact, he actually made the comment. He said, so we are asking, why would the Secretary of State, who's got so many things to worry about in an age of terrorism, have things focus on this? He said, we're focused on the oceans, and what does it have to do with my life every single day? And he asked that question, then he answered. He said, look, if we don't get this right, then everything else is actually immaterial. And he was passionate about it. Now, this next picture, I really show this gratuitously. Because when you're the science and technology advisor to the Secretary of State, and you get a picture of the Secretary, of him standing in front of a periodic table, you take that for a win. Now, the problem was, I actually didn't take this picture. This guy, Nicholas Kahm, did. And so I had to scrub high and low to actually ask lots of people if they had any pictures of this. And he said, yeah, there's this one person. If you go on Google Images and you find it, well, then you have to get permission. But I just love the fact, I mean, I actually hung this up in my office after it came out. Said, see, we're having impact. In fact, the role of the science advisor to the foreign minister is gaining traction around the world, as more and more of the issues of diplomacy depend upon science inputs. Early in my tenure, I launched a network of science advisors to foreign ministers, which at the time consisted of the US, the UK, Japan, and New Zealand. In recent years, this number has actually increased to 14. So 14 countries now have somebody who has the dedicated role of science and technology advisor to their Secretary of State or their foreign minister. So looking at the historical and potential roles of geoscientists in diplomacy, I think back to one of the most important lessons I unintentionally learned by being raised by a geoscientist. Once as a young boy, I joined my father in a visit to Claire Pat Patterson at Caltech. Inside his office, these two geochemists got into a heated discussion and were raising their voices and arguing. After departing, I was a bit shaken. I was about 8 years old. And I was shaken by this tense exchange between my father and this other grown man. And I asked my father why he had visited this man whom he clearly did not like. My father replied, Pat, he is one of my closest and most admired friends. We were discussing different ideas on how lead isotopes should be used to understand an important problem. Looking back on that experience, I appreciate that they were two friends with strong mutual professional admiration. Rather than jeopardizing their friendship, that argument, and many others like it, allowed them to fully understand all sides of the problem and begin working together to find ways to solve it. For decades now, geoscientists have been central to solving so many of the issues of the world. And while I have only scratched the surface based on some of my own experiences, there is little doubt that whether it be climate change, ocean health, sustainability, or other issues, the students and researchers in this room and beyond will contribute to the understanding of the actions taken at scales from local to global. In fact, AGU and its membership are not only a community of global change, it is a community of global changers. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to spend some time with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that presentation. That was wonderful. I just want to ask a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. I wonder if we could go to your what you were presenting about the Sustainable Development Goals. And I've worked a little bit in the agriculture, sustainable agriculture area, and you emphasized oceans, and there are several others of the Sustainable Development Goals that touch on either very centrally or at least tangentially on many of the topics that AGU scientists study and are experts about. And I think one of the challenges of the SDGs being really successful is having quantitative indicators that are scientifically defendable. And that's a real challenge for us as scientists to kind of go into zone of a little bit of discomfort of coming up with really simple indicators.
Yes.
I think is what you need for that, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe you have a different opinion.
Right.
And so we're really trying to simplify the world, and that's not the way we write papers.
Yeah.
And yet, if we don't have quantitative indicators, will the Sustainable Development Goals actually be able to do what they're supposed to do in terms of showing progress? So I'm sure you've given that some thought. What are your reflections on that?
So I think that question of indicators and actually data for those indicators is actually central to the way that you're going to address any of these goals. And in fact, there have been some mechanisms set up to look at how to do this, both at the global level through the UN, but up until the change of administration, the Obama administration, particularly through the Chief Technology Office and the Office of Science Technology Advisor to the President, we're very much looking at this question. How do you develop the right metrics? How do you develop the right data? How do you develop the right quantitative sort of analyses for how to even measure progress towards this? The other piece of this is actually, in thinking a decent amount about the role of sustainability and what the sustainability goals are and what they aren't. Well, first of all, for those that have been involved in international policy or UN policy, you realize that oftentimes it is a political filter. It's a political prism through which things go. So if you start off with the idea that sustainability and sustainability science has created this target, this direction that has been driven much more by the underpinnings of the interfaces between the social, economic, environmental sciences, and that's sustainability, and that gave a target. And then you took the prism of the UN and took the white light of sustainability and decoupled it into 17 political pieces. The big challenge are two. One is actually, what are you measuring? And how are you relating the measurements in 17 bins in a way that they interact with each other? So that you're actually thinking about sustainability as an integrative piece, not just a series of measure progress towards climate change, measure progress towards very sort of abstract targets. Now, one of the things was, I think, useful in the Sustainable Development Goals is that there are 17 goals, but there are 193 targets. And each one of those targets have built into them some degree of metric based upon a numerical understanding of how much cleaner has the water gotten. But, and this is where I think a lot of organizations like AGU and AAIS and the academies can really be helpful, not only in the US, but critically internationally, is helping to identify what are the actual things that should be measured. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, if we don't get that right, then you just get 17 targets that people report on every 5 years and say, yes, we're making progress. So the number of organizations, ICSU, well now with the International Science Council, a number of academies, like the Inter-Academy Panel for Research, have tried to figure out now what are the metrics that we're using, what are the targets that we're looking at, and what are the things we can actually measure and report and be able to translate that progress towards progress in specific areas.
Right. And sometimes that involves further definition of what is sustainability.
Absolutely.
Or sustainable. Right?
Well, and in fact, I think that's why you've ended up getting 17 discrete goals, because sustainability has a very broad base and it has a lot of different pieces to it. And I think one of the amazing things that I know AGU has been critical in working on, and I know the academies has been very active in, is developing a robust field of sustainability science, which actually has metrics associated with it. The challenge and the opportunity is that when you bring that into a policy realm, it then turns it into things that the policy community can understand. Clean air, clean water. Well, you actually have to put numbers to that.
Right. So I want to ask one other question on a different line, and maybe while we're talking about it, people who are interested in asking other questions can queue up at the different microphones around the room. But I wanted to turn the discussion a little bit more towards career paths. You already spoke to us about how you are literally a child of AGU, but you've taken...
so not literally, because that honeymoon was in 1962, and I was born in 1971.
That's a little bit too much.
And my sister was born in 1966, so I think...
Okay. I didn't mean to go there, but...
That's for the American Biological Association.
Oh, yeah, right.
But
you have So you talked about your schooling and your education, but then at some point you must have made a very deliberate decision to take a non-academic career route.
Yep.
And I know a vast number, perhaps the majority of graduate students in the United States and other countries as well, are facing a circumstance where they're looking at the probability of getting a tenure track job at a university might be less than 50%, or in some cases, some disciplines, much less than that. And so many students are interested in looking at multiple possibilities of career paths. And I wonder if you could reflect on your own experiences and if you'd have some advice for students or their student mentors who are out here regarding that.
Sure. So I will first start. I was fortunate because I actually grew up in an academic family, actually through a university. And I loved it. I loved watching it. I loved that community that was in there. And I felt that one of the most important things, and I think that because of the group that we're talking about, one of the most important things when you're going into quote unquote policy is actually you need an expertise. That actually is important to have, we call it the union card. You need the union card that shows that you know how to actually.
American Geophysical Union?
It could be the American Geophysical Union, absolutely. Whatever the union card is that brings you into that space. My own trajectory was probably driven by the fact that I've always had that interest in that coupling of science and policy, even from a very young age. I think partly was because my father, who was very, very much of an academic, was also very interested in a very broad range of issues and very interested in not only having lunch with the geologists, but critically having lunch with the historians and the political scientists. So growing up in that community actually gave me a lot of connection with a non-scientific community, a non-academic community in some ways as well, because the number of students went off to different things. I actually, as an undergraduate, was told by one of my favorite mentors when I was going to my freshman class. I was going in, he was my freshman advisor, just assigned to you. And I asked him, I said, here are the courses I'm going to take. And I showed him all science courses and maybe even a math class. And he was in the medical school and said, no, don't do that. You're at a university. Expand, take it for what a university is. Expand your horizons. So he actually took my course sheet, which was 5 classes in a lab, and knocked off 2 of them and said, put in there, took this history on contemporary, I think it was contemporary Soviet studies, or Russian, it was the transition, no, it was actually Soviet studies at the time. And then another class, which was an anthropology class. And so I started doing that, and I got interested in international relations. But I was always interested in geoscience from my time growing up. I ended up doing a double major, international relations and geoscience. And actually what was interesting was seeing how closely coupled they were. Because I was working on, as an undergraduate, looking at radionuclides. And that all came out of the Atoms for Peace conference and how that was utilized. And the Atoms for Peace conference obviously had implications for things like the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the International Atomic Energy Agency, which at that time was actually coming in because you had the Iraq War starting, the first one around that had to do something with those issues. And so keeping that interest, but then wanting to go and get an expertise, because that's the other thing that I was told. Get an expertise. Do something and do something well that no one could take away from you. So I went and got my PhD through the 90s at the University of Virginia. At the same time, I felt like a real idiot because that was also the time of the tech boom. And all of my friends from college who said, you don't need an expertise, I'm going to go out to California and start any .com they could start and make money. And so I would see them when I'd go to AGU meetings and have them buy me dinner because they were making enough money that they could. Really got the chance to stay in that, but I stayed interested and took classes, even in graduate school, or would audit classes outside of my expertise. So I would go into the operations research courses or others. And what I found was just a gravitation towards thinking about the interface between science and policy. Now, by having a PhD, one of the things I was able to do, which I mentioned briefly, was to actually do a AAAS policy fellowship. I know AGU has a congressional fellowship, and I think that for those that are interested, at least in Washington, whether you are as much now is to be determined, but for those that are interested in at least trying to get into the scientific community, into the policy community from a science community, those fellowships are really, really valuable. And I had just an amazing opportunity to learn from my first day, and I'm sorry I'm going long on this, but I don't see anyone lining up, so I can keep talking.
We have one over here. So.
Okay, sorry. But I remember my first day at the State Department, and we were having this meeting on climate change policy issue. And we were walking in, and there was this person whose name was De Silva. And I walked out, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and I said, well, that gentleman's name is De Silva, but he kept talking about being from South Asia. I said, but De Silva sounds like a Portuguese name. And as I was leaving the State Department the first day, and this person turned to me and they said, yes, De Silva, that was from the Goa, that was from the Portuguese migration. And for the rest of my walk from State Department up to DuPont Circle, where I was living, I had this conversation with this person who was a Foreign Service officer who had been based all over the world, done a PhD in actually the migration and immigration into South Asia. And what I realized at that time, I think really embraced, was in this place, I brought a certain expertise from being a geoscientist, but there are people that had just tremendous knowledge across the board, and just sitting in that sort of movable feast of a place was just so intellectually interesting. Now, it doesn't mean that all government is always intellectually interesting. Sometimes you bang your head against the desk, but what you're around is people that have this, like a university, these diverse expertise and interests. And the little bit that you can contribute, and being a fellow was one way to do it, but whatever the different ways, being part of actually, and this is not a plug for you, but being part of committees of things like your technical society, engaging is really important. And I think we're seeing that more and more.
Thank you. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Drew Snoffer. I'm at the University of British Columbia. I'm from the States, though. Thanks for that great, that great slice of life and your perspective, and it was very inspiring to see that type of science and being filtering through in government. I was a little surprised to hear that no mention of next year's meeting in Washington, D.C., though. I'm wondering if you could share any avenues you're aware of for us to sort of engage some of the policymakers, or suggestions for avenues that we might take to do that. And Eric, if you have any follow-up on that, I'd also be interested to hear that.
Yeah, I would. I think that I think by circumstance, AGU is actually having moved out of San Francisco for at least a short period of time, is actually an interesting opportunity. One is to get more of a place-based piece. I mean, coming to a place like New Orleans, which clearly, when you look at the geosciences and particularly around the Gulf issues, not only the hurricanes of the last year, but other issues that clearly have a policy piece to it. This is a really remarkable place to be. And by the way, thank goodness for all the steps, because my wife is going to kill me when I go home and I put on 15 pounds from eating more red bean and rice than I ever should. But I think that one of the things that's really interesting about Washington, and for a geoscience community to be there, is to use that as an opportunity. And this is actually not just for this meeting, just in general. Look, in democracies, the people that oftentimes have influence are the people that are heard. And the people that are heard are very often the people that go out of their way and get out of their comfort zone and interact. And so when you are there, use that as an opportunity to find, not only in the executive branch, the people that are actually funding your research. That's important to talk to. There are people that are actually you've had that conversation with. But find other people. Find other outlets and venues where at least a large mass of geoscientists being someplace can begin to interact with their congressional leaders. That's really important. It's really important to maintain, anytime, some sort of dialogue, some sort of conversation. Doing things that are actually, like I said, outside of a comfort zone. It's one of the things, I remember my father saying, is when he said his job was to knock down somebody's idea and leave just enough for somebody else to come along and knock down. And really what that tells you is, our job is to think outside, beyond the orthodoxy. And so there are communities that we're used to engaging with as scientists, but being in a place-based, like going to Washington, is an opportunity to not only interact with the same people that will go to the AGU meeting, but people that are there by location. And so take advantage of that.
Right. I would just add that certainly we are trying to think as broadly as we can, and we've taken the opportunity of this meeting to talk to many of the people from the agencies as to what sorts of sessions would resonate best at all levels, from the top brass down to other members of the agencies who maybe can't travel to meetings like this one. But I think it's really important to emphasize that these ideas aren't, I mean, certainly AGU will be working at our DC headquarters to try to be working on this, but frequently, most often, the best ideas are bubbling up from the sections and from the members. So we welcome innovative ideas on how to take advantage of that meeting in Washington, D.C. And of course, we're going to have to get going on it. We've already been planning, but we're going to have to step up that planning process pretty quickly hereafter. I see we have some more here. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks a lot for your talk. My name's Mika Little DeVito from the University of Alberta. And my question's more directed towards, you spoke a lot about the importance of scientific research in democracy. And I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for how to engage more people who don't necessarily believe in science and have science have more of a forefront in international and national policy making, especially because you'd mentioned that there's only 14 countries that have an actual person designated for this. So I just was wondering your thoughts on that.
Sure. So those 14 are 14 that have what is a very strange position, which is the science advisor to the foreign minister. Okay. So there are a number of other countries that have, chief science advisors to the government. This was directly related to a foreign ministry. So, but it's a very good question, and the question is, and so I would start by saying it's a very broad term to say people that don't believe in science. I think that's a very broad brush, because I think that there are people that, particularly in specific areas, many of them that AGU worries about, don't look at the science that exists or don't trust elements of the science or have problems with it. But broadly speaking, one of the things that I think is true is that everything has underpinning it, and it gets to the 17 goals, by the way. You mentioned a few of them. Everything actually is underpinned by science and its discoveries and its applications. And part of the question that I would think about when I was at the State Department was that it was oftentimes a group of people that didn't necessarily think about how science related to their activity. But because we actually had a large number of scientists that were also conversant in relating what somebody's priority was to the science that could help it, they were able to become very good communicators of science to a policymaker. And in that way, so it wasn't, Science Advisor to the Secretary is a wonderful title, it's a great thing, but really what I mentioned before is it was oftentimes the fact that the State Department had 300 PhD scientists and engineers working in it across different places that understood what the demand was and could articulate why science was important to that demand was important. So part of the challenge to the scientific community, and I mean this having seen it from a level, is there's the science, and oftentimes you're translating the science into something. But a critical piece when you're dealing with the policy interface is doing what I think scientists can do well, but don't often do it, is to understand the nature of the environment into which you're bringing the science. And the political science part of that is to recognize that oftentimes policymakers have a set of issues that they really are responsible for or really care about. And so how do you bring to bear the science, the engineering, the social science in a way that matches what the question is that they are asking or should ask? And that's oftentimes actually an extra step, and it's sometimes difficult. And so part of the reason why these science advisor positions, whether they're specific science advisors or people that come in for fellowships, are so important is because they serve as that translator, not only telling the policymakers what the science community is thinking, but critically going to the science community and saying, this is what the policy making community is worried about. What do we need to think about from the science to inform that?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. By the way, we've had 2 Canadians.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Really loved it. By the way, I'm also a Canadian by birth. So my name is Ankur Shah, and I'm a student studying atmospheric science at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. My question, I'm very much interested in solutions to sustainability and the bridge between science and policy. My question was, there's obviously a conflict between political interests and scientific interests, and what scientists would like to do and what politicians do. So as an individual, what are the major limitations of your position? If you'd like to do something, but you can't because of your position, what would they be?
So luckily my position is done. I left the State Department, and so
okay.
I have other limitations, but not some of those other things. Well, I will say that it dovetails very nicely to that earlier question, though. That when you are in a place where you're trying to engage with policy, one of the things is to recognize the environment in which that policy exists. And I did see, so I will say that, one of the interesting things was having been the science advisor to Secretary Kerry, and then having stayed on for a little bit into the next administration and seeing how priorities shifted, or at least the things that were priorities were no longer priorities. Whether they articulated the next set of priorities was not as obvious until by the time I had left. So what you do in that situation is I think try to anticipate what things are that are going to be issues that at least need to be made aware of. I think the most important thing for anybody, I mean this for anybody, and I think in science we see this a lot, is to also be intellectually honest. If an issue is an important issue, and you think it's an important issue, the best thing you can do is raise it, recognizing that somebody might not want to hear it and somebody might want to hear it. But if you don't raise these issues, then you're actually not being intellectually honest. And so, or if you anticipate that somebody won't care about it. We had an example where there was, in a different area, in gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9 was this very rapidly emerging biotechnology. And somebody on my staff dealt with risk management and the biosciences and said, this is a big issue, this is a big issue. And we just took a chance. We said, we think this is a really big issue, but we also think there's something that's going to have a foreign policy component to it. And not the secretary, but next level below that. We spoke to this person and said, we think there's actually something coming up. And the staff on that person said, well, okay, but there are lots of priorities. Well, sure enough, later that week, I forget if it was The Economist or Time Magazine, something that this person was reading, talked about this genetic revolution changing everything. And because we had started to at least begin to make contacts with the scientists interested in this, started preparing sort of why this was important, once that topic actually came top of mind, it was very easy for that person to say, you know what, I've heard of this before now. Let's think about what we can do around this space. So some of it is just, there's a little bit of the playing soccer at the, pick soccer with your friends. Sometimes you just have to hang around the field, and somebody will eventually ask you to come in.
Thank you.
I'd like to follow up on one of my questions about young scientists, early career scientists making decisions about career paths. I've heard a number of students in the geosciences and environmental sciences feeling very discouraged at the moment, and even questioning whether they've gone into the right field. And I imagine the same is true, if not even worse, for those who have been thinking about going into the foreign diplomacy field at the moment. But I imagine you have a longer-term perspective on that. And what would you say to early career scientists who are feeling that discouragement currently and wondering whether there is a future for them in those fields?
So it's very easy to get tactical. It's very easy to look at where things are at a moment and think, and this is true I think in any part of one's life, and think, oh my goodness, this is this isn't going to end, and no one's ever going to care. I mean, I remember the nights where my daughter would, when she was young, would start crying, and you'd think to yourself, oh my goodness, this is never going to end. And sure enough, morning came, and you do something else. And as times go on, it's different ways. You're saying, oh my God, this is never going to end. But what I think, two parts of it. One is the development of a skill base. Skills are fungible. They are translatable. Sometimes they're not, they don't translate to exactly the thing that you want to do, but they're translatable to other places. And there can be some innovation in that. So one of the things, I'm a professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And one of the things that's really interesting is that most of the students are taking, so I teach a science, technology, and international affairs course every now and then. And a lot of the School of Foreign Service students there are actually taking that class. It's the fastest growing major in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown is the science, technology, innovation. And there's a reason. A group of people that used to go into the Foreign Service and think that they had to be trained to go into a foreign service and took political economy, even before sort of the latest stuff, were beginning to realize that was not their priority, that was not their interest. Their interest was actually going to Facebook and going to Google and going to other opportunities. And they realized these were technical companies, that even if they weren't going to be the ones to do the computer programming, they had to at least, as they were giving sort of the foreign policy parts and foreign policy advice to these big companies, they at least have to have some credential that made it look like they understood what science was or what the issues of technology were. And so even within that space, they were looking at skills development fungible to a different place. And I would say that particularly for scientists that are going into different areas outside of academia, the ability to maintain an interest but a flexibility at all stages of life is actually really, really important. You know, I was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not totally. I did want to become the shortstop for the New York Yankees. You know, I couldn't hit a curveball. That was a problem. And the result was, I mean, not that I had a lot of flexibility at that time, but just doing different things and being willing to adapt as you can to those things and bring your skill set to it.
Well, I bet you've been thrown some other kinds of curveballs.
Yeah, there are other kinds of curveballs.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'll try to keep it short. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Julio Herrera. I'm a postdoc at Stanford, not from Canada, from Mexico, so NAFTA.
NAFTA, yeah.
My question is following up on a bunch of the things you've said. One of the challenges when it comes to communicating science to policymakers is not just being able to get rid of jargon, but also understanding their own language, their own jargon, and their own protocols and rules, unwritten rules. So I was wondering if you could give us any advice in terms of how to get more acquainted with, again, sort of the language, the rules, to make it less intimidating for a scientist to go to the Hill or to engage with a policymaker to make sure, obviously it's very different from a science meeting. So if you have any insights.
It's a great question. The numbers of meetings where you sit there and people start talking about something in a different field from your own, I mean, foreign policy, and you sit there and what you do is you take on that, it's maybe a very Washington thing, but there's sort of this fake bit of knowledge that there's no way that you could be proved that nobody knows, that you don't know what they're talking about. And so you smile and you nod a lot, and yeah, right. And then you repeat that same jargon back. And that actually helps. So especially acronyms, oh my goodness. You just say, oh yeah, we really have to think about the GCRP on this one. That's important on that one, yeah. And then you go back and you go to the Google machine and go find out what the hell that was and you think. But part of it is that part, it is just being around it. It really is, and I often think about with the policy piece, it is a language in and of itself, and like most languages, there's the formal part of the language, and there's the slang, and you really only learn the slang when you live in the place where that slang is spoken. So I think part of the advantages of things like fellowships or short-term visits to places of policy, whether at the state level, international level. I mean, the UN has a whole set of jargon which is different from what happens at the domestic level. But it's to actually sit in that place and you begin to absorb that slang, much like you absorb slang that takes place in, whether it's even a village in a country versus what the region speaks. And so I think that's oftentimes the best way. There are some obvious ones that are good. One of the things I always think is read a policy journal. just read it. They're actually interesting. I think one of the big, and not to go off because I saw we got to wrap up, but one of the challenges, when I was a graduate student, we actually used to pick up journals and read them cover to cover. And what that meant was you're often reading something outside of your field and constantly thinking, how does what I'm working on apply to that field? How does an isotope geochemist, how does an isotope geochemist think about this problem in anthropology? Well, there's an application to that. But if you don't read, and then when you go to policy, that's even a step further. How does an isotope geochemist think about this issue that is coming up where the DPRK is doing certain things or North Korea is doing things? Well, you actually have to have read about it a little bit to think about it.
Thank you, Vaughan. And would everybody please join me in thanking Dr. Turekian once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.